Iranian author Azar Nafisi writes a memoir about her personal experiences as a female literature teacher in Iran. In reading Lolita in Tehran, the author details her experiences about a book club she formed with her 7 female Iranian students, where they meet up a few times a week and talk together and read Western literature. The author structures her memoir from personal stories, her personal life as a female Iranian teacher, as well as her female students' experiences. This opens up a window to the reader into Iranian culture, especially as it pertains to women. The book is organized into 4 sections: Lolita, Gatsby, James, and Austen. In Lolita, Nafisi describes her students and sets the tone for the rest of the story. They explore totalitarian society and compare it to life as women in Iran. In Gatsby, Nafisi rewinds back in time to when she was living abroad in the United States and describes her return home to a post-revolutionary Iran and the disappointment she felt. Throughout Gatsby, Nafisi illustrated to her students and to the reader the metaphor of unattainable dreams and how this connected to Iranian people's dreams, hopes, and disappointments surrounding the Iranian Revolution. In James, Nafisi lets the reader get to know her on a more personal level as she discusses her personal choices and struggles as a female teacher during the revolution. She expresses her inner turmoil where she feels conflicted and lost, not knowing where she belongs. In the last section of the memoir, Austen, the author makes connections to Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In this section, Nafisi focuses on the problems that Iranian women are facing, such as divorce, custody, the imposing of the veil, as well as general themes of self-respect and self-image as it related to the Iranian women. So, how reading Lolita in Tehran connects to one of our course objectives or to multicultural education in general? All throughout this memoir, the author elicits reader empathy for the characters and those for who the characters represent. In other words, Iranian women, Middle Eastern women, people from theocratic regimes, stuff like that. I agree with Nafisi when she states that the biggest sin is to be blind to others' problems and pains. Not seeing them means denying their existence. On the other hand, Nafisi teaches us that a great novel heightens your senses and sensitivity to the complexities of life and of individuals and prevents you from the self-righteousness that sees morality in fixed formulas about good and evil. As one of Dr. A's students described of Dr. A doing a courageous act, she said, "Such an act can only be accomplished by someone who is engrossed in literature, has learned that every individual has different dimensions to his personality. Those who judge must take all aspects of an individual's personality into account. It is only through literature that one can put oneself in someone else's shoes and understand the other's different and contradictory sides and refrain from becoming too ruthless. Outside the sphere of literature, only one aspect of individuals is revealed. But if you understand their differences and dimensions, you cannot easily murder them. If we had learned this one lesson from Dr. A, our society would have been in a much better shape today." This eliciting of empathy transcends just the characters and the cultures represented in the book, but it demands the reader to question his or her beliefs about other cultures as well. As one of Professor Nafisi's students said in the memoir, a novel can be called moral when it shakes us out of our stupor and makes us confront the absolutes we believe in. This memoir does just that for the reader, thus lending itself well to multicultural education. This book also fulfilled course objectives because it made us analyze theories of ethnic identity. Nieto reminds us that culture is a human creation, dependent on particular geographical, temporal, and socio-political contexts, and therefore vulnerable to issues of power and control. By reading Nafisi's memoir, the reader is offered an illustration of exactly how culture can become vulnerable to socio-political contexts and power and control. Nafisi's memoir makes the reader more aware about aspects of ethnic identity and how easily one's ethnic identity can become conflicted when a single identity becomes imposed upon a whole group of diverse people. In the case of reading Lolita in Tehran, Nafisi takes that reader on a journey that explores how living in a secular world that has suddenly turned into a theocratic regime can cause an individual conflict and confusion about his or her ethnic identity. In reading Lolita a Tehran, we also contrast conflicting themes of assimilation and pluralism. Once again, this is illustrated to the dramatic shift in society where one moment Iran was a secular state and in the next moment it was a theocratic regime. Many cultural distinctions from the secular period disappeared as the Ayatollah forcefully created this new culture for Iran, in which there were harsh consequences for any and all who did not comply. For the Iranian citizens, they are left with the inevitable culture shock and going from religious pluralism to forced assimilation, as well as the loss of cultural identity that comes along with such a dramatic societal shift. Nafisi's memoir demands the reader to also analyze how culture affects learning and achievement when Iran transformed into the theocratic state. The bookstores stopped selling the literature she was teaching, and this required her to make photocopies of the material for her students, making the materials harder to come by. The syllabus became ever more restrictive, and classroom lectures became interrupted and restricted by the morality monitors. During the regime, women had no control over their lives, their movement, or even their dress. This oppressive culture directly affected women's learning and achievement as they had no control. In a conversation between Yassi and the author, Yassi explains to Nafisi why all the normal acts of life had become small acts of rebellion and political insubordination to her and to other young people like her. All her life she was shielded. She was never let out of sight. She never had a private corner in which to think, to feel, to dream, to write. She was not allowed to meet any young men on her own. Her family not only instructed her on how to behave around men, they seemed to think they could tell her how she could feel about them as well. What seems natural to someone like you, she said, is so strange and unfamiliar to me. This revolutionary culture made life even more difficult for non-Muslims. The government began limiting non-Muslims from attending university classes, and they also made it a requirement that non-Muslim business owners had to have a sign on the front of their stores indicating their religious affiliation. People were arrested, flogged, jailed, and or even killed for the most minor offenses. Considering the society from which the author comes, how did she use principles of cultural competence and cultural responsive teaching in her practice? What might I have done differently in the same situation? Well, I think Nafisi was wonderfully culturally competent and culturally responsive in her teaching. According to Gorski, in 2010, there are several shared ideas that make for the foundation of conceptualizing multicultural education, such as the following. All subjects must be presented from diverse perspectives. Inclusive curriculum also means including the voices of the students. Concepts such as the canon and classic literature must be interrogated, again with the idea of accuracy and completeness. Educational materials should be inclusive of diverse voices and perspectives. Students must be encouraged to think critically about materials and media. Whose voices are they hearing? Whose voices are they not hearing? Why did that company produce that film? What is the bias the author may bring to his or her writing? Nafisi fulfilled all of Gorski's ideas exceptionally well in her classes, as well as with the students in her book club. She was always challenging them with diverse perspectives, their thoughts on various subjects as they related to the novel and to their current lives, and she always let students have a voice in the curriculum, particularly when she put the novel Gatsby on trial when the class was split on its morality and appropriateness, and used this trial as a teachable moment in which students were required to think critically and argue their positions. Nafisi also applied what Hossain refers to as teachable moments in the classroom, as well as with the students in her book club. The Gatsby trial is an example of a teachable moment in which the author took student inquiry and debate as an opportunity to initiate intellectual discussion about real-world issues that are affecting them as students and as Iranian citizens. As far as teaching is concerned, I admire Nafisi, and I can only hope to be half as great a professor as she is one day. However, given the immediate circumstances of the revolution, the only thing I would have done differently than the author is I wouldn't have returned to the university and complied. Instead, I would have left the country just as many U.S. citizens are now doing amidst the political turmoil. However, I can understand how the author felt trapped and confused and maybe didn't want to leave because Iran was, in fact, her home. What the issues and themes mentioned in Reading Lolita in Tehran mean for society, which could be my school, my corporation, my neighborhood, or society in general? Well, religion, gender, and sexuality are all recurring themes throughout this memoir, all of which are pertinent issues that every society has their own struggles in dealing with. Religion, as it relates to the memoir, is addressed in how the author explains to us that Islam is the only allowable religion in revolutionary Iran. Gender is also persistently addressed as the reader sees the various ways in which women are second-class citizens, not in control of their own lives or their own dress. Thirdly, we have the issue of sexuality. Throughout the memoir, as it represents theocratic Iran, women are not allowed to express any form of sexuality. Even wearing mascara, nail polish, or even lip gloss is enough to deserve punishment. Hence, the mandatory veil. Any events or meetings where there are mixing of sexes resulted in extreme punishment by the morality police. Iran citizens were not in control of their own lives, let alone their own bodies, particularly for women. Also, through teaching her Iranian students about Western literature and making connections between Western literature and Western life to their own lives and to their Iranian culture, challenging their belief systems, and engaging the class in stimulating dialogue about real-life issues, she was using principles of cultural competence to affect social change, which in turn positively impacts society. Okay, so lastly, we have a summary of what I've learned reading Lolita in Tehran and suggestions for further research. First of all, I absolutely loved reading Lolita in Tehran. However, on a side note, if somebody is not careful, I became aware of how this memoir can potentially reinforce the dominant Western U.S. ideology because it delivers the story that those in the West would expect from women in the Middle East or Muslim countries. Stories that just scream oppression. For a reader that may not know anything else about women in Iran, it only represents oppression and women as helpless and oppressed. It glorifies Western liberalization and it will serve to reinforce stereotypes of the Middle East. Such a one-sided view can be a little poisonous. To reinforce this oppressed Muslim women analogy can just be dangerous, especially when read by those who don't have the historical and political context to fully understand the context of the story. Therefore, I would suggest anyone who is interested in reading this book to first brush up on the historical and political context because a casual read without this context makes this memoir at risk for lending itself to the recirculation of conservative U.S. ideology. Once again, although I loved reading Lolita in Tehran, I did initially find it frustrating at times because it was so metaphorical. I found it to be exhausting to keep up with the back and forth between her experiences and the detailed description and comparisons to Western literature. Originally, I was thinking to myself, is this really necessary? All this heavy reliance on literary comparisons. But after class discussions with peers in the book club, I was made aware of how the author used Western literature to transcend culture and prove that it can be interpreted much deeper than face value, and that perhaps in this case it was likely necessary because literature was such a big part of these students' lives, as you know, it was pretty much their escape. Okay, so that's all. thank you for listening to me for like 15 minutes.